been having a bit of a kick on Yu-Gi-Oh games on the channel, and I gotta say, I'm not opposed to talking about them, but we're kinda getting to the point where most of the games are just straight up card simulators without additional elements thrown in. Don't get me wrong, as someone who's currently trying to build his own Mimighoul deck IRL right now, I do love the physical card game, but as I've stated numerous times on this channel, I do miss the days of when the actual Yu-Gi-Oh video games would branch off from the actual card game and explore different avenues of gameplay, or take the card game and twist the rules to fit something different and make the game a lot more dynamic, if not bullshit. This wouldn't be the first time you've heard this, but one of the reasons why Pokemon has a lot more staying power than Yu-Gi-Oh, at least in my humble opinion, is that there's outside media that you can enjoy in the series if you feel the games have fallen on hard times. Whether that be the anime, the card games, or even the side games, there's a reason that Pokemon has a lot of staying power, and that's because of its diversity in its content. Yu-Gi-Oh doesn't really have that, at least not anymore, and even with the anime,
then we'll go back in time and unerase it.
Going back in time is impossible.
It's not if we build ourselves a time machine.
Dear God, someone shoot me now, we're in the darkest timeline. Listen, even with all my issues with the series of Yu-Gi-Oh, I still like it, and having gone back through a ton of older games and experienced them again has been a blast to do. But unless you guys can throw some obscure Yu-Gi-Oh games my way, we're slowly reaching the conclusion of the Yu-Gi-Oh game series. Oh my God, my ears, my eyes, my brain! And with that out of the way, let's talk about the one game that's been heavily requested since I started playing the games on the channel, Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters Coliseum. So, what exactly is Capsule Monsters? The more astute of you may have noticed that I asked what Capsule Monsters is, and not strictly the game that's on the main cover of this video. That's because there's a bit of a history with it. Unlike a lot of other Yu-Gi-Oh games, Capsule Monster Coliseum has a story to tell before the game even starts. Originally known as Capsule Monster Chest, this game came from the original manga of Yu-Gi-Oh, and it was how we were introduced to the character of Mokuba Kaiba, who was the champion of Capmon, something that was actually referenced in the PS2 game that we'll be talking about today.
Welcome to my stage, Yugi. I don't mean to brag, but I'm a Capsule Monsters expert.
But when we played before, didn't I defeat you?
Well, whatever.
Yeah, and the first time Mokuba flaunted this fact, he had a gang of middle schoolers armed with machine guns and tasers. No, I am not kidding. Oh, and Mokuba wanted to cut off Yugi's finger if he lost the game.
Poor twisted little freak.
The rules of the game weren't exactly explained well in the manga, or even in the show. We don't know the stats or the abilities of the monsters until they're just shown. The only thing that was shown was that they have levels and a set movement. Basically, every round the players would take turns to move a monster at a time. It must have been a favorite of Kazuki Takahashi since it showed up twice in the manga, and eventually the concept got its own specialized arc in the anime, where the original Yu-Gi-Oh crew had to fight against Alexander the Great? Okay then! There's also a short printed board game that has been featured in the same anime arc too. Unfortunately, the physical game itself survived less than Dungeon Dice Monsters, which is sad on multiple levels. And if we were to look towards some of the monster stats for both the physical game and the video game we're focusing on in this video, they are similar. Hell, one of the boards you could play in the physical game is actually used in the video game. It's this board that's used by Grandpa Muto. I'd love to tell you that I have my hands on this game, but unfortunately I'm not rich enough to buy anything related to this, because this was discontinued after a starter box and one booster box. There's a lot more about Capsule Monsters though, which I'll be referring to Capmon, since I'm sure I've bitten my tongue a few times in this recording. Son of a bitch! There are actually other games that are built around Capmon. Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Capsule Breed in Battle is a game that actually managed to expand upon the rules and how you actually can breed your own Capmon and have them battle. Honestly, if anyone can point me in the direction of an English patch for the game, I'd love to at least try it out. This game was made during the Season 0 era of Yu-Gi-Oh! And actually features similar gameplay to what we saw in the manga and in Season 0. But what we're able to gather, you essentially raise your own monsters in the style of Digimon, and then you can take them to battle against other characters in the game, along with there being a versus mode, and every monster has its own unique abilities and stats, as well as having a rock, paper, scissors mechanic. Unfortunately, this wasn't released in the West, just kept in Japan, so it's a shame. Another game that is tangentially related is Yu-Gi-Oh! Monster Capsule GB. It's a Game Boy Color game that we sadly as well didn't get in the West, but it looks interesting, especially since it has a plot that I find at the very least intriguing, which is sad to say because Yu-Gi-Oh! Games don't typically have a very detailed story. A little background. In the original manga, after Yugi defeated Kaiba, Kaiba was in a bit of a catatonic state where he was basically trying to pick up the pieces of his heart. However, after the events of the Monster World TTRPG arc, the Spirit of the Millennium Ring finds its way to the comatose Kaiba and possesses his body. He then invites Yugi and friends to participate in a Monster World tournament, stealing the souls of Yugi's friends and putting them into figurines. I bring this up because of the connection and gameplay with Capsule Monsters that is in the game, but also to point out there's quite a bit of another side of Yu-Gi-Oh! That I personally didn't even know existed, at least not until I started doing the series. And on the plus side, it looks like there's a fan translation for the Monster Capsule GB game floating around out there, since I was able to find an English playthrough, so who knows, maybe that'll be on the table for a future video.
Sure, Jan.
But I think we've gotten a little off track for the subject of this video. What about this game that I titled the video after? Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters Coliseum is a PlayStation 2 game that was released in 2004, which funnily enough was before the anime Capsule Monsters came out. Much like other Yu-Gi-Oh! Games, there isn't a lot of information on the development of it, which, trust me, I've tried my best to find anything about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Game's history in these videos. Most I could find was that the game was actually developed by a company by the name of Winkysoft, a Japanese developer who filed for bankruptcy in 2015 and have an interesting catalog of games, like the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Famicom game, a good chunk of Famicom Super Robot games, and Puyo Puyo for the Game Boy Color. Regardless, I think we should actually dive into the actual game, shall we?
And who's that? Oh, it's Mr. MVP, Sim!
If there's one thing I'll say about Capsule Monster Coliseum, it's that the game's presentation is very surprisingly well done. Like, legit, this is probably the best looking Yu-Gi-Oh! Game I've played on the channel to date. The characters are drawn dynamically and are presented pretty well. Hell, you know what really caught my attention with this game?
Ah, I thought you would come, Yugi.
Holy crap, we finally have voice acting in these games, and it's the actual 4Kids cast too.
Hiya, Yug. I've been waiting for you.
Yugi, here I come!
Ta-da! It's me, the man, the legend, Tristan Taylor.
Long time no see!
Sure, there are some hiccups with the lines, especially since they have to cut them in half so they can match the dialogue since it doesn't automatically play between lines, but that's a paltry complaint in comparison to this. Do you have any idea how much I missed actual voice acting in these games? Forbidden Memories? Sure, while there was voice acting in PlayStation 1 games, well...
To show you a terror beyond hell. That was our agreement, wasn't it? You jerk.
Take that back, you little turd!
I'm not trying to say that PS1 voice acting was completely terrible, but it was a different level.
Calm it down.
But then you got the PS2 and GameCube, and that's when voice acting really became more prominent.
What are you doing?
Okay, that's an infamous example, but there was some really good voice acting on these systems.
You sure know how to throw a party. No food, no drinks, and the only babe just left.
Even the GameCube had voice acting.
Shadow, what the fuck are you talking about? You're a beta male, Sonic.
My point is that the inclusion of voice acting can really elevate the experience with these games. Even if they're just one-off lines, it adds a lot more character. I'm just disappointed that this is the game that got the actual voice acting treatment. Not Duelist of the Roses, not Faustbound Kingdom, this one. Not that it's a bad thing. Getting back to the graphics of the game, each of the boards you can fight your opponents on are uniquely designed. You'll start off in a fountain plaza against Joey, then go to a biohazard laboratory with Tristan, outer space with Duke Devlin, a Broadway street in New York City for Taya, and so on. There are a lot more, and every duelist essentially has a unique board to them. And while you'll face against some familiar faces in the final area, they have unique boards. So that'd be 25 different game boards, each with their own challenges and unique designs. And what makes some of this even more entertaining is that the stages will actually transform. Sometimes the change will be subtle, like with Taya's stage. When this clock strikes midnight, the lights go off and the snow begins to fall, and when the hell did this turn to a Christmas video? Or how about when you're fighting Yami Merrick for the second time and then this happens?
I can hear it! I can hear it! Pharaoh! I can hear the shadows calling your name!
Holy hell,
That is brick and metal, man! We're fighting a volcano!
And now we're in lava. Ah! Point is that the game really plays around with the boards, and some of them can have effects on the fields. And not just cosmetic, but we're not going to get into that for this section. Point is, the game looks great in that regard. If I have to complain about something with the stages, it's that sometimes the themes don't really match with the characters. You'll have something like a wasteland for Rex Raptor that's riddled with fossils and poisonous gas to go with his dino theme, or you'll have Weevil the Bugmaster in the forest. Even Taya's stage makes sense since her dream was to become a Broadway dancer. But then you'll have Duke Devlin in space. Oh, wait. Bandit Keith in a pharaoh's tomb, or Mokuba in an electrical plant.
Twisted little freak.
But it's one that I do have to bring up, because it's not like you couldn't have proper levels that accurately represent the characters. Like how Bandit Keith could have been sent to casino, since his ace monster in the anime was Slot Machine and would go with his monetary-based personality. Oh yeah, there's also the music. Honestly, while the music was fine, it was pretty unique for a Yu-Gi-Oh game. Like, I certainly wasn't expecting Christmas music in a Yu-Gi-Oh game, that's for sure. While it doesn't have the same staying power as some previous Yu-Gi-Oh games, like, I doubt you're gonna top the Forbidden Memories tune of... But it does have its own charms. There's one more aspect of presentation, and that's the battling. Like a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh games, you can activate an animated battle scene between monsters. Before a battle begins, you're offered a toggle to turn it on and off. And while I don't mind the animations and how some of the monsters are just ripped from previous models in other games, I do have to be the bad guy here. Once you start a battle animation, you can't stop it, and these things can add up time, so eventually players will want to just skip these battles altogether, which is a shame because there was some effort put into these, but I can understand this. Presentation-wise, with a few hiccups here and there, I think the game looks really good and sounds great too. I do wish they would have taken the Duelist of the Roses approach when it comes to representing the monsters on the field, since Roses has the models of the monsters above the cards when you play them. Still, the game does a lot more positive for the design work than negative. I do wish other Yu games at the time did things in this game, especially the voice work. Alright, there's one more thing to talk about, and that's the story of the game. There really isn't one, so that's why it's at the end of this section. The only narrative tool that we have is that there's a tournament going on, and you're playing as Yugi and your goal is to win! I'm not against this. It's kind of fun to actually playing as Yugi and Yami Yugi. Now I can live out my dream to be like Dan Green.
It's time to duel!
I do wish there was more to narrative, but that doesn't mean I don't mind it at all, but that's only if the gameplay is actually solid. And surprise, surprise, it is!
Who wants to play video games?
This is where the bread and butter of the game is, and I will say, as a game, Capsule Monster Coliseum is fundamentally strong. It has a few hiccups, but on the whole, it's a fun experience once you get the hang of it. Of course, while I say that, after we put a name onto the game, and we're finally given the option to crystals where we can make a custom build or having a starter kit, it's confusing. Now, if this is your first time playing this game, you'll have no idea what any of this means. You see, in order to play it, you need to make a statue that represents you on the field. You need to pick an attribute, and then add the cosmetic parts of it. They don't have an effect on your piece or monsters. The attribute is pretty much the only important factor. Again, you wouldn't know any of this if you're just starting out. So it's probably really tempting to just take the starter kit, but let me tell you, no! Don't do it! It's a trap!
You triggered my trap card!
You see, starter kits don't allow you to distribute stats for this piece that you're making, and pretty much 2 out of the 3 stats are useless. The stats are as followed. MP, Monster Points. This is essentially the money in the game, which you may think having a lot of money at the beginning is a good idea, but it's not really. Not only do you get MP from beating opponents, but Monster Points are only good at getting more monsters, and you can still get monsters by beating your opponent's units in battle and claiming up to 2 of them at the end of it. AP, Action Points. This is the most useful stat that your piece can have. Action points are what you use to summon monsters and do actions in the game. This is the stats you'll need in order to play the game optimally. And finally, PP. Power points are the health of your statue. You see, in each match, you can win the match by destroying the opposing team's statue, so it has its own health pool. It sounds like it's necessary to have a lot of health in the game, but in my experience, I was only attacked once. You just gotta have your defenses up with your monsters and you'll be fine. Now, I brought up the attributes, and I suppose I should talk about them. In tradition to a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh games, there's an attribute system where some attributes will be stronger against other pieces, as well as gaining a boost in certain areas on the game boards. Now looking how this is done, it's clearly messy.
I understand.
Well, that makes one of us, buddy. But to make it simple, there are at least two different chains for elements. Light is strong against dark, dark is strong against earth, earth is strong against thunder, and thunder is strong against light. And then we have fire beats wood, wood beats wind, wind beats water, and water beats fire. Now, it's fine if you want to do something like that, but when you make fundamental changes to elements or parts of a game, it's going to cause a little friction. Like, it makes sense that Earth is strong against thunder monsters, but how are thunder monsters strong against light? And how is Earth weak against darkness? What about wind being better than water? I understand that there would probably be some logistical nightmare if they were to do a Pokemon-based type chart, but the type chart is a little confusing, especially when you have familiar with Thunder being effective against water types. I personally would have done a more generalized type chart with 3 additional elements. Fire beats wood, wood beats water, water beats fire. Thunder beats wind, wind beats earth, and earth beats thunder, with dark and light just being more neutral attributes. But that's just me. So after we get our statue created, it's time to buy some monsters.
What would you like to do?
This old man is my bane in these videos. I'm playing your grandson, Yugimoto. Couldn't you just throw a few cheap monsters at me just to help out? So monsters is what you really need to focus on here. It's generally accepted that you get monsters that are the same type as your crystals, since your crystal's element will give you a boost. Though maybe I'm just blind as a bat, because I sure as hell didn't notice that much of a difference in the gameplay. In any case, each monster has an attribute, HP, attack, defense, power points, and action points in 2 variations. Also, every monster has a different movement and attack range, which can come in 3 different ways and have different reaches. There's the straightforward, the diagonal, and the star. The most typical would be the straightforward movement, since it allows a piece to move in straight lines and attack in straight lines as well. As I stated before, each piece has its own range and movement and attack. It can also be one square or multiple. Diagonal does what it sounds, where it moves on the tiles on the board in a diagonal manner and will attack in the same way. And finally, the star is a bit more complicated. These are the pieces that can skip over areas or attack from a distance, but they're also the most cumbersome to really plan for in the game. When a match begins, you're allowed to pick your pieces. Now, you can't just pick your strongest pieces because you start off with a set amount of AP, and the stronger monsters will have a lot more AP to use them. So you need some weaker pieces out on the board as well to help fill out your ranks. And sometimes the arenas will also have tiles that will affect your pieces, depending on their attributes. So before the game begins, you need to consider the field, the monster's attributes, the strength of the monsters, and how they'll move on the field. You can also have a strong monster like Feral Imp at the beginning. It does have good attack and also has good range, but it can also be a bit too costly to use. I will say that the first opponent you face, Joey Wheeler, does a real good job of having an opening opponent that can show off some of the key factors in the gameplay. Joey's units are all the same. They don't have too much danger going on, so it allows the player to experiment with the system, and when this happens...
What? You can't be serious! This can't happen!
we can see that his fire units are weak in the water. So it alerts the player that there are elements on the board that can affect units and that the stages can change during a match. That's great because it can add a new degree of challenge in this strategy game. Some pieces can have great movement but limited attack range, or vice versa. You will want to set up with all that in mind as well as your AP costs. The problems come with the execution of the system. The attribute boosts often feel negligible, especially when the field and your statues boosts. I personally prefer the stages that have obstacles on them instead of just boosts. One of the earliest opponents is Tristan Taylor, and he can be a pain if you're not aware of how his stage works. The area is cut into 2 paths, both with hazards that affect pieces save for their own elements, wood and thunder. Or when you're fighting Rex, there are some spaces that will damage non-earth monsters if they remain on those squares. I like the hazardous stages, since it forces you to play around with how to move. Then there's also the opponents. Don't get me wrong, there are some great opponents that are really well thought out. My Valentine only has wind monsters that have great movement and will get a boost from the arena, while also also have fire monsters that can cover the wood weakness that her wind monsters have. Then there are some opponents who just get shafted. Mako Tsunami is a great example. Since while he has 3 water monsters, he doesn't have any good wood monsters to cover up his water monster's weakness to wind, and even in his stage, which starts off covered in water, but then the water gets erupted by a rock and shipwreck, which would limit the amount of squares that would give a boost to Mako's water units. Then there's the movement aspects. I found this to be the biggest issue when there are some specific tight locations you can't get through easily. Bandit Keith's stage I found to be the most cumbersome to get around. But these are smaller complaints. Frankly speaking, if the stages were randomized against your opponents, the Mako complaint wouldn't be all that terrible, since it's something that any player wouldn't be able to see coming and could be more randomized event to change the situation for players. However, there are 3 elements that really do hold this game back. The first is the level system. Throughout the game, your monsters and even your statue will gain experience. Once you get 100 points for each one, you can level them up. It offers it to you because this stuff can increase your monster's stats, but also AP costs to them as well. It's a good system where you don't want to overpower one monster that'll suck up all your AP during your matches. The issue comes from your opponents. They don't level up their monsters. Oh, they can level up in the midst of combat. What I am talking about is every opponent you face off against starts with level 1 creatures. While their base level monsters do get stronger over the course of the game, they're still just level 1. And by the time you reach the final parts of the game, you'll more than likely have some buffed up units that can slam them down easily. And this stems into the second issue, replayability. When you clear an area of opponents, you can't challenge them again, at least not in any good capacity where you can get more monsters. And in free mode, you can't save your progress. When you beat this game, which the game is really short, you can probably get through it in 10 or so hours, you can restart the whole thing, you can fight everyone again, and you still have your units from the previous file. However, they'll still retain their same monsters, the same levels, and the same units, which is a shame since there are monsters that can be used for each character. Just imagine if Joey, when you faced him a second time, he actually had his key monsters from the anime, like Flame Swordsman and Garuzis. That way you can keep the fire theme going on, but you can also give him monsters like Thousand Dragon to cover the water weakness, and give him his ace monster, Red Eyes Black Dragon, just to throw a curveball at the player. But nope, no matter what, Joe will keep using all 4 Fire Reapers as his units. A monster he's never actually used before in the anime as well as I'm concerned. Or going back to Mako, the only iconic monster he uses is Fiend Kraken, despite the fact his Fortress Whale is in the game. Same with Jellyfish. Hell, Weevil Underwood doesn't get to use his iconic monster, Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth. And finally, the biggest issue with the game is acquiring monsters. I know I brought this up as how you don't need to worry about getting MP for monsters, but the game makes a lot of hoops to get some of the monsters in the game, and that's not counting the fact that there are a ton of other monsters that are actually programmed into it that you can't get them. No Machine King, no Black Skull Dragon, no Blackluster Soldier. But that's not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at the evolution and fusion aspects of acquiring monsters. Unless you know this going in, most players aren't going to get that you can actually evolve your monsters or fuse them together. That's because you need specific conditions to do so. I'll start with fusion since that's the less egregious of the two. Most people who are familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! Will probably be aware that fusion has been a staple of the game since the game's inception. So when you have monsters like, say, Time Wizard and Baby Dragon, most people think, oh cool, I can fuse these two together to make Thousand Dragon. And you can. Under conditions, the first thing that the individual monsters have to have the right level, which isn't a problem. For the example I gave, you need to have a level 3 Time Wizard and a level 5 Baby Dragon. And when you do have them on the field at the same time, you can fuse them together. It's not hard to get this going, but you will lose 2 pieces that you made to fuse them, so be sure to do this. There are only 17 fusions in the game, and a good chunk of them are easy to understand if you apply some logic, like having 3 Harpy Ladies to make Harpy Lady Sisters. The big issue with this is that you're never really told what requirements you need. I basically had to look online for a guide for these. But the bigger issue comes from evolution. Some monsters, i.e. 18 of them, and some of them, 7 to be precise, need to be the right level, then you can evolve them. However, the remaining 11 require not only the correct level, but during a game, they need to be on the right tile that can give them a boost to their element. For example, if you want the Petite Moth, you need to have it on a wood tile that gives a 30 wood boost to have it evolve into Larva Moth. Now, I wouldn't have an issue with these two mechanics, but the biggest issue is the game never tells you about them. Maybe if an opponent did this during a match, that would have been something. After all, make it a secret technique that they're doing, but it's something that only the player can reasonably do because the opponents you fight only have level 1 monsters. The gameplay is solid, however the issue comes from the execution, and it really feels like the game was rushed. A lot of the monsters that are in the game are the same monsters that have appeared in the other titles of 3D for Yu-Gi-Oh! Most notably Duels of the Roses, which came out in 2001, meanwhile Capsule Monster Coliseum came out in 2004. Now, fun fact, in 2004 there were 6 other games in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise before Capsule Monster Coliseum that came out. Most of them were just released in Japan, but 2003 also had a good number of releases, and the same with 2002. It's just odd to me that the models that were used in Duels of the Roses could have easily translated to Capmon's game. Or hell, look towards the GameCube game too for that. And how the post-game is nearly non-existent with the opponents not having stronger monsters or even leveled up units. It makes it hard for me to really say this game is great, which sucks because honestly the core gameplay is pretty good, especially considering that the game isn't a card game but rather a strategy game. The boards are interesting, the core gameplay is fun, and frankly speaking, if given a little more polish, it probably could have been a great alternative to the card game, especially if it was done in a digital market. I can see something like this really taking off in the online spaces where you collect monsters, can battle against other people, and even power up your monsters in the off time. Hell, it's basically another form of Pokemon, and that's something that can be done for fun.
I had fun.
I had a lot of fun with this, not just with the game, but going down the Yu-Gi-Oh! Pipeline. And I found Capsule Monsters to be a fun idea that, again, was cast to the wayside. I've already talked about the disappointment of how Dungeon Dice Monsters, a game that is somewhat similar, was created and even got a physical release, but was killed off because of Konami's incompetence. And Capmon is sadly the same, only sadder because there was a physical game at this point is now lost media. If I ever get to a point where I can get enough support, either through my videos getting enough traction or getting support on Patreon, Ko-Fi, or channel memberships, yes I am shilling, but I am serious, if I ever got enough support, I would love to reinvent these games for a modern audience because there are fun games that have essentially been lost to the sands of time. What's worse, that we're slowly getting to the point where people aren't actually going to be able to experience these games. Like, recently there was an announcement for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Early Days Collection, which is having some games we never actually got in the West. But there's no guarantee that games like Capsule Coliseum or Dungeon Dice Monsters will get that treatment, nor does it actually address the issues with these games. Don't get me wrong, I'm glad that there are collections being made for them, but that doesn't mean the games I've been covering on this channel will be included, especially when some of these games weren't all that well received at the time. Look at ING's review of this game when it came out, giving it a 5.9. And unfortunately, a lot of people won't be interested in it because while the game certainly isn't perfect, I just got done explaining why it's highly unlikely that the game would be remade or even fixed for current day gamers, which in all honesty sucks. This game was fun, and it's a shame that it was held back by time constraints and poor decisions. But that's just me. I leave the conversation to you guys now. If you guys enjoyed the video, give your thoughts on this game, and if you're interested in playing this game, copies of it for a physical PS2 are still found around at decent prices. I managed to get my hands on a working copy for $50, but otherwise you can get your hands on a ROM. Be sure to leave a like, a comment, and share the video around. It really helps the channel out greatly and pushes me to make more content like this going forward. I'm MangaKamen, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Later!